What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Chop and Brew. I am Chip Walton. Last episode of Chop and Brew, we showed you how to make hard cider at home using fresh pressed apple juice. In this episode, we're stepping it up a notch and we're showing you how to make ice cider. For those of you who don't know, ice cider is a rich and decadent dessert drink made by freezing either apple cider or actual apples, slowly thawing them to collect a high gravity and concentrated must, and then fermenting that. Our guide through the process of making ice cider is our good friend Jeremy Olsen. He's won numerous awards for his ice ciders and has traveled to Quebec, which is the motherland of ice cider, to learn from the professionals about how they make ice cider and bring that process back to his home ice cidery. Real quick before we get the episode rolling, I want to give a quick shout out to just a few of the worldwide network of Chop and Brew Patreon patrons. This week I'm looking at you, Andy Carter, Bailey O'Kittle, Frederic Wallenheim, and Julian Cheel. Your ongoing support keeps the party going for Chop and Brew. If you want to join them, patreon.com/Chop and Brew. Get some cool rewards, get some cool bonus stuff, and just help us keep this going. But it is now time for the ice cider. We are here with Jeremy Olsen, Dr. Jeremy Olsen. Are you a doctor of ice cider?
Not yet, but if someone offers that degree, maybe we'll have to look into that a couple years down the road, I think.
Dr. Jeremy Olsen, we're in Minneapolis. He's a member of the St. Paul Homebrewers Club, and he has some pretty sick credentials that justifies him schooling us on ice cider. Tell me about some of your awards.
Sure, I've been making ice cider for the last several years. I've won first round NHC and also second round NHC 2 years ago. I got a first place medal there. I've won Best of Show at the Minnesota State Fair last 2 years in a row for my ice cider, and a couple other regional competitions as well. So it's been a fun ride the last couple of years, learning the style and entering it in competitions and drinking it as well.
He's invited me over to start the process of an ice cider in his basement. We've got a couple of commercial examples. For dessert, we're gonna drink some of these gold and other medal award winning. Your gold in 2015, you said, was your first?
That was the first year I made ice cider. Made it, turned out well. I got good feedback from the club, entered it, and won gold at National Homebrew Conference.
So tell me about the process. Is it difficult?
Sure, it's not difficult. It's just time consuming, and you have to have a little bit of space, freezer space, and time just to let this happen. So the basic process of an ice cider, think of it as an iced wine, except you're making it with cider, obviously, instead of grapes. And so my basic process is freezing solid apple juice. I get fresh juice from our local orchards here in the Twin Cities. Freeze it solid. Then you let it just slowly thaw. My basement runs about 55 degrees right now in the winter. So I let it thaw. 8 gallons, 9 gallons. It's going to take me about 12 to 16 hours to thaw. It'll look like a snow cone in the middle. It'll just be ice left over. And all the color will drain out because that's all the sugar and the flavor that's being thawed off first. And you want to get a really nice concentrated runoff, and that's what you're going to ferment. And so what you're doing is by this process, you're removing all of the water, essentially, or most of the water, leaving you with the concentrated apple sugar mixture. So starting with 8 gallons, I'll end up with 1.5 gallons to 2 gallons of runoff. I shoot for a starting gravity of at least 30 bricks. 30 to 35 bricks is a good starting point for your fermentation. You can see some of that concentrated juice is melted away, thawed off, and now it's just going to be juices and sugars melting off of the water, leaving ice behind. It's kind of a big center block of ice that will remain in the container here.
So it's kind of like when you're running off a mash, as far as a homebrew analogy, the volume you need to be a little less strict on. It's more about hitting a number.
Correct.
Of fermentability.
Yeah, correct. You can't shoot by volume. You have to shoot by your sugar content. If you start at less than 30 bricks, it's not going to be a nice, delicious, thick cider, and you're not going to have enough sugar left over when you stop fermentation. So you want to shoot by gravity. If you have kind of a lower gravity cider, like one I did early this spring, early this fall, it was the starting gravity was only 1038, so I didn't get as much gravity off of that, or as much runoff off of that. The initial running is 43.9 bricks, versus later in the fall, our club by cider is 1048. So I'm just going to be able to get more volume from that. The key is you can't push it. You can't try and get a little bit more dilute and hope that you're going to make it through, because it's not going to turn out the same in the end.
You get what you get.
You get what you get. Yes, you get what the apples give you.
And then you said a couple of times you've kind of let it thaw completely after getting what you were going to use just to experiment. Tell me about what's left behind in that 6 to 7 gallons, whatever.
You have a big like ice slushy just left over, a big solid chunk of ice that's left over in my, I use my mash tun because it has a bottom outlet. And what I let it thaw completely once, and I think the gravity was about 1010 to 1015. So there's very little sugar left in that.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah, you're really extracting all the sugar and the apple flavor out of it to use for your fermentation.
So what kind of yeast and like what kind of massaging does this take to happen?
Yeah. I use white wine yeast. 71B is my go-to. I've experimented with a couple other as well. I know a lot of the Quebec cider makers, where this style originated in the late 1990s, use champagne yeast. So you want a white wine yeast that's going to be able to ferment something this high. Beer yeasts just won't. They won't start. It's too concentrated for the beer yeast. So a nice white wine yeast, ferment it cool, ferment it long. So you get all of the nice apple flavors, fruit flavors that come from this, and not a lot of the off flavors that could come from the yeast.
So at that point, is it similar to doing a mead as far as the timing, what you're looking for, even the aging, or does this kind of come together quicker than a mead might?
I think in a lot of respects this ferments very similar to most of my meads as well. I found with ice cider I can just do a single nutrient addition at the beginning, add some ferment O, hit it with a minute of oxygen, pitch my yeast. Make sure you always start your yeasting. If you're using the dry yeast, use Go Firm to rehydrate your yeast, because you want healthy yeast, but it's going to be a long, slow fermentation. So I haven't done staggered nutrient additions like I do with my meads, and the ciders have turned out really well. So. And
you said, I mistakenly assumed earlier that this was a centuries-old tradition. This is 1990s.
1990s, and Quebec started at Domaine Nige, is one of the first orchards and cideries to start the style. So it's a relatively new style. There are a few U.S. cider makers that are starting to do this, but primarily these are coming out of Canada. They're different based on the style of ice cider. We can talk about that a little bit as we drink a couple of these commercial examples. But really, you want that really just nice, rich, deep apple, which we get out of this for sure.
You uncorked it, and it instantly just like filled this whole area of that rich apple.
Yeah, you sometimes get a little bit of that cooked apple, apple pie, not the apple pie spice, but just kind of that apple pie cooked flavors from it. Sometimes a little bit of caramel or the dried fruits from it.
What do you definitely not want from it? And bad ones you've had,
You don't want this to smell like alcohol, because it's supposed to be think of this as a sweet dessert drink. Okay, so you don't want it to smell like alcohol. You don't want it to smell like just raw apples. And some tend not to have a lot of aroma. One we might try later maybe won't have as much. The aroma can vary, but it needs to be kind of that just really clean fermentation characteristics as well. So you don't want to get green apple acetaldehyde out of this. You don't want to get I think alcohol would be the big thing. It shouldn't be a booze bomb. If it's done that, you've fermented it too long, and it's not an apple, or it's not an iced wine anymore.
And the ABV range, I don't think we've thrown that out there yet. It's 9 to 12.
9 to 12. Yeah, many of the Quebec styles are 10 to 11%. You can do less if you're going to make a sparkling, especially if you're going to kind of naturally carbonate it in the bottle. It's obviously going to be a little bit less ABV, but 10 to 11% is a good starting point. So for those of you doing the math of starting gravity and ending gravity on that, your ending gravity really honestly should not go below 1050. If you go below 1050, there's not enough residual sugar. It's going to be thin, it's going to be alcoholic, and it's not going to be this really pleasant, rich, complex drink that we have here.
And I absurdly asked earlier, might you have to back sweeten your ice cider?
Sure. Well, obviously you could if you want to, but really...
with a final gravity of 1050 plus.
Yeah, so with good slow fermentation, your yeast may just stop at about that point. And if your yeast stop, my recommendation is to let it be. Don't try and repitch, because then if you get a new healthy yeast that start going, it's going to go well below where you want it to be. So I generally follow mine starting at about a month out, see where it's at, check the gravity, and check by taste. And honestly, I stop mine based on taste more than the gravity, and it's never going to go too low.
We might be ready for our second sample, but tell me the process of this one versus our second sample.
Sure. This one from Domaine Niche is an ice cider that they make primarily for some restaurants in Quebec, and they sell in their store as well, which is where I bought it. This one uses Northern Spy, Golden Russet, and Macintosh apples as their apple varieties here. And this variety is going to be juice that's frozen naturally outside, and then they thought in the exact same process that
What do they call it?
This is called cryo-concentration.
Cryo-concentration.
Cryo-concentration is you're just concentrating the sugars in the juice through freeze and then thaw process.
And then the next one.
Oh, hey!
Oh, hey! Here's the next example.
We're back with another example here.
So this one was made very different.
Correct. So this is from a different cidery in Quebec, du Minot. Pardon my French, I can't speak it. So this is called cryo-extraction, and this variety of ice cider is made by leaving the apples to freeze solid, whether on the tree or picked in just in totes, and then they're crushed and pressed while frozen.
What month would this happen?
Well, January, February, when they're solid,
so they
frozen.
just leave them on the tree.
Cortland apples in particular are known for staying on the tree. They'll stay on the tree after a freeze, and they can just pick them off the tree and below zero weather and press them. Other apples can be picked and just stored until they're frozen. And by doing it this way, they can control the sugar content very carefully. The colder that the apple is when they press, the more sugar, less water they'll get. Let it warm up a little bit. There's going to be a little bit more available water when they press, and they got a little bit lower sugar content.
This is so different.
Yes.
This tastes...
The first thing we notice, right, is it's darker. This is distinctly darker than the first sample that we had.
I'm getting just like so much, like it's this weird mixture of brown sugar and green grape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so it's like not even all that apple-y.
No, it's not. It's sweet. I definitely get a much sweeter aroma to it. I agree that kind of that brown sugar, almost kind of like a candy, and not a gross candy, a good candy kind of aroma to it. And when we drink this, it's not as thick. You know, the mouthfeel isn't as thick as that first sample that we had. I think that's actually just a cidery difference and not a style difference, because in reality, a bunch of juice is collected, is fermented the same. And so this is just a style difference. In this sample, I get a little bit more of the tannins and the acidity from this sample than I do from the first sample. One of the keys in cider making is that balance between alcohol, acidity, and tannins. Those are the kind of the three basic things that you want to balance along with sweetness. When you're picking your apple blend, you don't want to do a blend that's all crab apples, because you're gonna get so much acidity and tannin. Once it's concentrated, it's not going to be a very drinkable drink. And you don't want a lot of pure, bitter sharps or the other cider apples, because you can get so much, the tannins in there as well, that it's not going to be a good drinkable cider. You can't. I've never needed to, but you could adjust your cider after fermentation if you needed a little acidity or tannin to it to help balance it, or if you want to balance the sweetness a little bit. Cut down on that, you could add some acidity or tannins, but it's not necessary, and I've never needed to do that.
Why Quebec?
I don't know. That's where they started. They made it. So now
It's cold. I mean,
It's cold to make a lot of
it's easy to
ciders.
freeze naturally.
There's a lot of orchards there, so they like their apples and their ciders. And now it's ice cider is actually a protected domain name for this type of cider from Quebec, and there's very specific guidelines of how these need to be made to qualify as an iced cider. The guidelines are there's not a lot, and it's pretty straightforward. It's basically that the orchard that grows the apples needs to produce the cider. It needs to be naturally cold, so frozen. In the winter you can't save apples till the summer and then put it in a big industrial freezer. You can't back sweeten or add other sugars, so you can't add sugars ahead of time for the fermentation.
Between iced cider and maple syrup, I think I could live in Canada.
All right, a little poutine as well on the side for you.
So we're here with the first and the older of the two Dr. Olsen ice ciders.
Mm-hmm. This was my 2015, the first ice cider I ever made, and this is the one that won first place in the final round of the National Homebrew Conference.
All the way.
Not quite all the way. Not cider maker of the year.
Oh, well, but still.
Close, yeah. It was a good year.
Is it a category all to itself, or do you just win the cider category if you have the best?
There's two. The standard ciders are like New World cider, English cider, French cider, and then the New World Perry and traditional Perry. So kind of like more of just your standard ciders, different styles. And then there's a specialty cider category, which is your New England ciders, ciders with fruit, apple wine, ice cider, ciders with herbs and spices, and then specialty cider, which covers everything else that you might want to throw into cider. So apple wine is different because that's usually adding a lot of extra sugar and or freeze distillation after
you make
after
a cider
fermentation.
and then you freeze it.
Correct. So that's going to be a much thinner body, higher alcohol versus the ice cider, which is this really complex depth of flavor, larger body.
It's got a nice acidity.
It does. This one,
I feel like we've kind of gone back into like sweet balance with acidity, balance with a little tart, not quite as brown sugary, desserty as our second Quebec sample.
This one, I get more of just kind of that upfront apple flavor and character to it. I agree. This one definitely has more acidity than the two Quebec styles that we tried. I don't get a lot of tannins. There's just kind of a hint of them in here.
Yeah.
So this batch was just a single run of the cryo-concentration. So it was about 8 gallons, and I got about 1.5 gallons out of it.
So this is like one of 15 bottles or something?
I think this is actually my very last bottle that I have of this. So it was. This is the night to open it.
When's the last time you tasted this batch? Casually.
Probably 2015 sometime. This is
really shortly after winning. You're like, let's have one.
Well, I think I tasted it in the process and making sure that the bottles were good. I actually found this one downstairs when I was gathering our other samples to try for here. I didn't know that it was there, and so I really haven't tried this in 2 years, and it's aged really well. I wish I would have saved more bottles, but so be it.
Let's taste 2017 right now. So we're on the last sample. 2017 Best of Show at the Minnesota State Fair, which in itself is saying a lot because Minnesota loves its mead, its ciders. We've got great honey and apples.
And a lot of great mead makers and cider makers in this area. So
yeah, and I remember I judged the Best of Show at the State Fair, and we kind of go in order and we kind of crisscross and we throw ones off that we know aren't going to make it, and the whole time I was just kind of like, I know this is going to make it. Like, this was beautiful. So tell us the difference in your mind between this and its cousin from 2 years earlier.
Absolutely. It's the exact same process that I use. I still used 71B for my yeast, fermented cold and slow, and then let it clear and bottle afterwards. But this one's smelling it. There's a lot more apple character. It's much brighter.
So much brighter.
Up front.
It's kind of everything ear. Like the apple, the sweet, the acid. It's just so much bolder without being offensive.
I think this one has a little bit more residual sweetness that balances out the acidity of this, whereas the 2015, and maybe age is playing a role in that in terms of losing a little bit of the sweetness. I found the acidity to be a little bit more up front. This one is a little bit more balanced in that regard in terms of the acidity.
Man, this is so good.
But this one tastes really damn good, actually. I'm glad this is held up as well.
So this last year at HomebrewCon in our backyard, Minneapolis, you gave kind of a presentation on this. What was the response from the crowd? What did you kind of hammer home as kind of like your main takeaways?
Absolutely. So I think my big take-home points on this is your starting gravity and your final gravity, and that's where it really, really, really makes the difference. Is you have to have a high starting gravity. So I say 30 to 35 Brix. You can go higher. As high as your yeast will tolerate, you could go. So if you start your runoff, you forget about it, it's overnight, it goes faster than you anticipated, you check it and your runoff is at 25 Brix, which I've done before. That's too low. Don't do it. This is not going to make a good ice cider because there will not be enough residual sweetness left over. If that does happen, freeze it again. Just do a second process. Also, I've done that in the past, and it works really well. There's no harm to that. And then the second thing is stopping it at a high enough gravity. You want, I promise you, the gravity needs to be 1050 to 1060. The Quebec guidelines are 130 milligrams, or 130 grams of residual sugar per liter. That equals out to about 1050 in terms of specific gravity on your fermented product.
You're saying even if you need to stop it with chemicals?
Correct. So I think I'll have to check my notes. This year, the 2017, I actually did stop. I sulfited it and put it in my freezer at 30 degrees to stop fermentation. Because it was getting there, I was really happy with the way it tasted where it was. I didn't want it to go any further. So my recommendation would be is ferment to taste. Let your taste buds in your mouth be the guide, because that's going to really let you know where this is supposed to be. But keep an eye on the numbers and don't try and get more alcohol out of it, because then it will thin it out. If you're brewing to make as much as possible, this is not the style for you. If you're making something, if you want to make something that's really interesting and unique and special, and you can take the time, and you can live with yourself of losing that kind of volume in terms of your starting product to your ending product, this is something for you. One other thing in terms of cider making that's a little bit different is oftentimes when you get your fresh juice with cider making, you'll sulfite it, let it sit for a day, and pitch your yeast. Don't sulfite this before you freeze it, because you will concentrate all the sulfites into your runoff. And I've done that, and then I've had, actually this year, I learned this lesson last fall, when I got my runoff, and it literally did not, I pitched it 3 times, and it did not take off. I didn't have a bubble of fermentation, because I had so many sulfites in there, the yeast were inactivated. So I bubbled some CO2 through it for a couple of minutes to blow off all the sulfur, repitched my yeast, and it took off.
What?
Yeah, absolutely. Just bubble CO2, you blow off the sulfites, or all the sulfur, and then you can start over. So the sugar content's high. It's really cold for your runoffs, so there's no need to sulfite this at all. So now I don't add any sulfites until I'm done and bottling, which just helps with stability in the bottle.
Jeremy's going to hook us up with a couple of recipes, some tips, maybe a little slideshow action from last year's HomebrewCon. Man, this I really appreciate. You broke out some gems.
So hopefully next spring you'll bring some over here and we'll try some of your ice cider, huh?
Aren't we too late?
Well, next year.
2019.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Just get a bucket, freezing outside. You can do it. It'll be fine.
I should ask that, and this probably should have been way earlier. But
yeah.
Here's your question for the end of the episode: Can
Absolutely.
you do this with the store-bought cider that you would do for regular cider, Indian Summer or
Absolutely.
what have you?
You can for sure. I've done that. I did that once actually to have ice cider for my talk at at NHC. Because you're going after the sugar, right? So store-bought stuff is fine as long as it's not pasteurized with any sorbates or anything like that. So if you can get unpasteurized or UV pasteurized juice, Indian Summer works great. The one time I did it didn't have quite the complexity and depth that I've gotten out of this, but it was very good. It was a good ice cider for sure.
And again, though, you got to start with
add a lot, yeah.
this much
Yep,
to
absolutely.
get this much.
Absolutely.
So you got to be willing. The budget's got to be there.
You got to
Your cider budget's got to be on point.
yeah, you got to be willing to part with all that water that you don't need to make a good ice cider.
All right, let us know how your experiences go with the ice cider.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm
Cheers.
empty. I'm gonna go back to those other bottles. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chop and Brew. I am Chip Walton. In this episode, I make myself laugh sometimes.
I think, well, the crowd was probably drunk because it was like late afternoon, and so they were all, half of them were sleeping.
That's
anyways.
never happened at a 4 o'clock session.
No, never. I know, right?
Homebrew cup.
Absolutely.
We should just cut to that.
All right.
Be like, and then it'll just appear like, hey, like, oh,
All right.
stick your tongue to that, homie.
You first.
I might lose my left foot over it.
Well, you'll get diabetes much quicker if you drink this and maple syrup every day.
Right.
But you know, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and don't fight it.
He's a doctor.
Yeah.
I win. Holy moly. It's a long talking episode.
Kind of is, right?
But it's, I think it's good because you, unlike a lot of people who I'll end up doing this with, can like, I mean, you just kept it going. You're like, boom, 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 boom.
And
It's
also,
good
like-
that we had a point for each new sample, too.
But also, like, it's so straightforward. Like, there's not a lot to it.
Put the kids to bed. Jeremy's about to get crazy. Yeah, that sucked. All right. Someone said, too sweet, huh?
They did.
They're like, where's my kombucha at?
This is not a dry English cider. This is really sweet.
What are you getting out of this one we're drinking? Sorry, you're doing all the talking. I'm like,
You're drinking the whole sample here. So there's two cider categories in the BJCP guidelines. There's the standard ciders, which are actually I'll look this up and then we'll reset that.
oh!
Hey! So I bubbled some CO2 through it for a couple of minutes to blow off all the sulfur, repitched my yeast, and it took off.
That'll either make the bloopers or just not.
Let me double check the BJCP style guideline too.